So good evening, bonsoir, bonsoir, buenas noches, etc. And welcome to the second of our discussion evenings. We are very glad that you could join us, as I was just saying to the Zoomers. Whether you are on Zoom or, Aisha's joining us, or whether you're watching later on YouTube, as 65 views we have had now. So hopefully that's a lot of people interested in these kind of discussions. Or it could be that slightly one odd obsessive individual watching us 65 times. But whatever the case, we are pleased that you've come. Last time we shared a bit more about the reasons why we're having these evenings. And I went on a lot about the social advantages, educational, and from a faith perspective. If you want to look at all that again, feel free to go back to our last discussion evening on hope, and you can check out a longer version of our reasons for wanting to do it. But essentially, it's for a couple of things. The centrality of listening in the Christian faith, especially to perspectives and people who might be outside of our normal conversation circle. So it's important to listen to the views of others in topics that sometimes we might push to one side. And it's also, these evenings are a reaction against the polarized and often violent rhetoric that we hear too often in the media, talk of sides and winners and losers and us and them, which is unhealthy and perhaps even unchristian. And we could kind of symbolize why we're doing these evenings with this woman here on your screen now, Claire. Yeah. Fab, thanks. This is Megan Phelps Roper, and she was a member of the Westboro Baptist Church. You may have come across them. There's various documentaries about them. They are a sect in America who are known for protesting soldiers' funerals and known for quite provocative statements like this, saying God is your enemy. And they celebrated when people of even the Christian faith, but of all faiths and all ethnicities died. They're a very controversial church, if the church wants to allow them to use that name. But her story is an interesting one because she was a member of the church. Her family are members, and her job was to be on social media trying to antagonize other people. And she found that the more people disagreed with her, the more hate and persecution she received, the more that she thought she was right in holding those views. And it was in the end empathy, not argument, that helped her see things differently. She said on how it happened, it started with conversations on Twitter. I was there to spread Westboro's message of hate, but sometimes people would ask me, everyone hates you, that must be so hard. They were clearly showing interest in my experience as a human being. When people were treating me this way, I started to reflect that back to them too. Showing interest in my experience as a human being. The vital importance there of empathy, that it was when people wanted to listen to and connect with Megan as a human being that she was liberated, essentially. And she still has a Christian faith, but it's not of that ilk which was full of hate from before. And for those of us who are Christian, I think we'd say that we see that in the life of Jesus, that treating people as of worth, as of children of God, touching lepers, listening to women, welcoming children, sharing good news with foreigners, all these things, seeing and treating another person like they have worth, like they matter, can be liberating, can change the world. Which brings us, of course, to the topic for this evening. Black Lives Matter movement. It's a bit of a amorphous movement, and we're going to hear more from Mali's perspective on it. But from my reading, it kind of began to take shape after 2012 and the shooting of Trayvon Martin, 17-year-old African-American from Florida, and the acquittal of his killer. And that's when I think the phrase Black Lives Matter gained traction, and later the movement was founded from it. But it's of course become more ubiquitous this year following the murder of George Floyd in May. And since then, shockwaves were sent around the world, reigniting conversations about colonialism, unconscious bias, prejudice and privilege of different sorts, along with protests that were seen across the world. And certainly in Ponty, when these things happened, there were some calls to act instantly. There were some calls to think about it. There were some calls to work out what we were doing. Were we virtue signaling? Did we understand what the movement stood for? How could we be educated about it? So as alongside some visible expressions of support, we reflected on the issues in sermon series. We read some of the books that were recommended to us. And we had conversations with friends about their personal experiences. And so we're on a journey of education, and it's good to welcome Nathan along. And as part of that, as it's Black History Month, a month that we've marked in other years with various things, concerts and exhibitions and all sorts, we thought it was a no-brainer to look at this issue tonight as part of these new discussions. Many of us, myself included, can feel nervous about bringing up issues of ethnicity. And I was speaking with Moses actually about this before and saying how sometimes we can be scared about getting things wrong or not having the right language or tools to talk about it. And perhaps particularly so when the church hasn't always been a role model of inclusion and diversity. But tonight we are privileged to hear perspectives on this, on the Black Lives Matter movement and the wider beliefs and perspectives on it from our two guest speakers, who aren't self-defined experts on the issue by any means, but have different perspectives on the movement based on their personal experiences and beliefs. So we really are thrilled to be able to listen to them and have them kick off our continued discussions on it. So first we're going to hear from Mali Kakembo. Mali is a freelance writer and political activist who I just got to meet this evening, really. So it's been a pleasure to chat to him already. After a childhood which did include some time in South Wales, Mali studied history, I think, was it at Winchester University? I think, yeah. And recently moved back into the motherland, now living in Cardiff. And we particularly thank Mali because he was brought in at short notice when a previous speaker wasn't able to come because of work commitments. So we thank Mali and Aisha for arranging for him to come and speak. Our second speaker, well, we're thrilled. Yeah, I think I've said enough. We're looking forward to you, Mali. And our second speaker is someone that I was first aware of in our Presbytery meetings, in which we were the only couple of people under the age of 60, almost. So it's a thrill tonight to welcome Moses Tumukundi Tuta Sigenzi. Moses was a PCW mission enabler in Mid Wales before things went bad for Mid Wales and they had to hire some guy called Miara. Miara, you're wonderful, we love you. And Moses went on to become the Presbytery Mission Partnership Church planter in the Southeast Presbytery, which is the Presbytery that St David's Uniting Church is a part of. Moses is also a keen supporter of Christian Aid, so much so in fact that he married Christian Aid's head of Wales team, who was a friend of the church. It's wonderful, Moses, to be able to welcome you tonight and to hear what you've got to say to us. So a quick reminder of the involvement, because we're not just here to listen, we're here to share our thoughts as well and our ongoing discussions. So what we're going to have tonight is each speaker are going to have 10 or so minutes to share their perspective on the subject. We've given them quite a wide brief so they can bring in personal experiences or history or theology or politics. I don't know what they're going to say yet, but I'm certainly looking forward to hearing it. And after that, or during that, you're encouraged, the Zoomers, not you YouTubers, that's why you should come on Zoom. You Zoomers are the gallery of gorgeous individuals. You are invited to send me a question for Moses or Mali. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. The easiest way is through Zoom. So I have to look at my instructions for this because as Claire and Moses and Mali found just before we start this evening, I'm terrible at Zoom. There is a chat function on your Zoom. Some of us know this well. If you don't, if you look at the bottom, normally there are 3 dots often that says more, if you're on a laptop anyway, and there's a chat function. And if you tick on that, and then if you tick on Fill Wall, you can write me a question privately. And then I will ask Moses and Mali, or one or either or both of them, later on when we have our questions and answer session. If that's too confusing, or if you can't find the chat function, you can text or WhatsApp me, and I'll check those later on during the break or during the group discussions. So I think that's about it. Guest speakers, group chat, Q&As will all be done by 9 o'clock, so you can go and watch Ambulance, which is a beautiful life-affirming show, or whatever you want to do at 9. But for now, it gives me great pleasure to hand back over to Mali. Mali, over to you.
Hey, can you hear me, guys? Hi, guys, I'm Mali. Thank you for having me. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you about Black Lives Matter. I went to primary school in Tonguinlais and I lived in Nantgarw for a bit, so I was kind of local to you guys for a while, I think. I currently live in Ely in Cardiff. My knowledge on the topic comes from two main areas, I'd say. I'm mixed race. I've got a Ugandan dad and a Welsh mum. So it gives me two slightly different standpoints from which to approach the topic, although that doesn't mean that doesn't cover all the range of views. But as well as my family, I'm a committed political activist. And the anxiety that I'm not wasting my time fighting for the wrong cause compels me to read a lot around the topic. So I like to think I'm pretty well read up. But of course, there's no better way to learn about these things like movements like Black Lives Matter, except through action and participation. I'd call myself an agnostic. I went to church a bit as a child, and I went to a Church of England boarding school, and still taken an interest and openness in religion. And Christianity, especially, I feel an affinity to, because it aligns, I think, a lot with my worldview. The Brazilian Archbishop Helder Câmara famously said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint, but when I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist." And I do ask why they are poor. And communist is often seen as a dirty word now, but when I interrogate poverty and exploitation, I feel proud and determined, and I don't feel any shame at what label I'm given. Across the world, this exploitation and poverty is afflicted particularly viciously on Black communities, both in the global South, Africa, and in Wales. But I've been informed that you guys are quite a progressive and active community, so I don't want to preach to the choir regarding Black Lives Matter and, you know, basics of telling you why it's an important movement, but I'd like to discuss why it's inextricably linked with our current bigger form of society and how this plays out in Wales and how we can resist it in a way that I think the Bible strongly advocates for as well. It's not a conspiracy really to say that oppression is actively advocated for by those in power. There's the explicit intellectual defense of inequality by our politicians and the huge financial support given to governments by huge corporations, huge support given to governments that propose slashing support for poor people by the huge corporations. And I think that's ample evidence for the precise planning for the way things are set up. President aides in America have openly admitted that the war on drugs was an effort to disrupt Black communities, and our Prime Minister Boris Johnson said explicitly that inequality is essential for the spirit of envy. You know, and this is whilst protecting its millionaire net worth. And I think it's clear that the people who do have power have very little interest in changing the power structures that be. The people in our society, people with unseemly amounts of property or capital, haven't achieved it democratically. It's for their interest that communities who built the communities who built this wealth, that inequality is imposed upon them. And it's important that they are marginalized and silenced and repressed. As is the case for most women, countless Black lives have been given to build the wealth of today's world, and yet they see minuscule portions of it. Such an abomination can only be upheld with very strong structures that are willing to inflict violence and, protect what the status quo at all costs. A large part of the government and discourse has been about defunding the police, abolish the police. It's very much kicked off with police violence. And obviously this is a very sensitive topic. I think many people understandably treasure the police for their role in, protecting communities from violence and, putting bad guys away. And so to an extent it's alienating, I feel, when this anti-police rhetoric is brought up. But also, arguably more importantly, misses the fundamental cause that results in, police inflicting violence on Black communities and disproportionately locking them in cages in prisons. Until we challenge these huge concentrations of wealth, I think that the capitalists that controls continue to provide salaries and weapons and jails, then this problem of bad police and however much of a portion of the overall force they are, and their violence will always exist as long as there's property and capital to protect for them. Now, a lot of these ideas don't have to necessarily be viewed as racial, structural inequalities just between rich people and poor people, or, imprisonment by police who work for the government. And often I've heard white people say, or my peers say, well, I'm poor too. Why is it just about Black lives? Why don't all lives matter? And I sympathise. I agree with the emotional questioning of this. Why isn't there more recognition for the white person on my council estate who keeps the world running with their job in Sainsbury's, especially during a pandemic? Yeah, it's only taking home minimum wage. I strongly feel that this concern is valid. Where is the voice for them too? But the lack of hope and aspiration within capitalist realism has created a fake contradiction here. It's not I'm white and oppressed, so how can Black people be oppressed? It's the vast majority of us are oppressed, especially Black people. And so I believe that it's crucial to those who wish to maintain status quo that this divisiveness, why is it this rather than this? This divisiveness is maintained rather than, a strong solidarity is built up. And recently I've been getting into the psychology of it, and it's actually fascinating, the mindset that causes, a competitive setting rather than a setting of solidarity. In the 2018 Journal of the World Psychiatric Organization, there was an analysis of 26 studies from around the world that linked depression and inequality. And 19 of those 26 studies say there's a positive correlation between inequality and depression. Only one said that there was a negative correlation. So the evidence overwhelmingly supports the idea that inequality causes mental health issues. And that's inequality measured relative. It's not just rural, that's not inequality. It's inequality in the sense that, yes, today here in Wales, we live better than we did 200 years ago. But inequality is still abysmal. The people, we can see people on TV or people living in a very few small number of people living in London, billionaires, millionaires. And this state of social setup isn't healthy for people's mental health. And it has profound psychological effects. This is articulated in the journal's status insecurity, which leads to individual feelings of social defeat and social isolation and alienation. And advertising, which is a core feature of capitalism, often preys on this status of insecurity. You rarely see poor people, council estate people on an advert, but you're very likely, to see on an advert for Bacardi rum, alcohol, someone on a yacht, living an unrealistic life. And it's preying on this insecurity. And it makes sense that people have these expressions of rebellion, crime, seemingly erratic behaviors at times. Sometimes they're organized protests, sometimes they can be individuals lashing out, but there is a fundamental symptom here of inequality that flares up consistently, which is that humans who for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years have lived in fairly equal settings are put not just in an uncomfortable, but in a damaging mental state by being surrounded by such inequality. And although that inequality exists in its most simple level, just between rich and poor, it is especially intense between black communities and white communities, or black communities and rich white communities. But moving on from these abstract ideas, I'd like to give some examples of how they play out where we live in Wales. Wales is in fact one of the poorest regions in Western Europe. This would be bad as a standalone fact, but I feel like it's worsened by the fact that it's only a 2-hour train ride from London, which is one of the wealthiest regions ever known to man. And I feel like it emphasizes the poverty that, not only absolute poverty, but relative poverty. And the result of this inequality within Britain is an incarceration rate far above anything else, far above anything morally acceptable, but also far above the average in Europe. So for every person put in prison in Europe, every person incarcerated in Europe, there's 1.8 people incarcerated here. So it's almost twice as many people we lock up proportionately here in Britain. And a big part of that is because of the hugely unequal society we have here. Supposedly we're one of the richest and most progressive societies in the world, but if you're going to measure that by your worst off people and how many people you're putting in cages in prisons, then we are lagging far, far behind. And within black and minority ethnic communities in Wales, that is especially exaggerated. Despite in Wales, black and minority ethnic people only making up 6% of the population, they make up 25% of the prison population. And in youth custody, it's 40% of the population. So these are hugely disproportionate amounts of black minority ethnic people that are put in jail. And that's not because I think as we'd all agree, they're not born, disobedient or violent or anything, but there are these structures of inequality that exist and that are crucial to our current societal setup that naturally result in mental problems, and they just mental problems, and people reacting in a way that isn't necessarily seen as, oh, this person is poor, how do we help them? It's seen as, this person is a problem, how do we get rid of them, how do we lock them up? I don't feel it's any accident that this inequality has arisen. £234 million a year is spent on maintaining these prison institutions. It's a lot of money that's not being given to equalizing the playing field, to reducing status insecurity. There's a lot of money being pumped into putting people in these cages. And so this poverty, as we are seeing, leads to protest and rebellion. But unfortunately, it also leads to a convenient other outcome for the upholders of the status quo. Communities who live in the worst conditions are affected by that poverty in terms of their likelihood to commit crimes, and those who live in only slightly better conditions, maybe white people who are also oppressed, who look at Black Lives Matter and they say, what's that about? Maybe people look at these Black Lives Matter movements and say, if we quiet down those communities, then maybe our lives will, improve. If we have less of these criminals running around, if we have less of these others running around, then, maybe that is the solution to our problems. But that mindset is, of course, only helpful to the people that hold power. And I'm not trying to say that, obviously, I'm not trying to group people just into two racial brackets, black people act one way and white people think this. Obviously, there's a huge crossover. There's loads of white people in the Black Lives Matter movement and plenty of black people that don't support that movement.
You could sum up in a minute, Mally. That'd be great. We've gone past.
Oh, really?
Yeah, no, time flies. But yeah.
I'm near the end. How long have I been?
Yeah, you've got over the 10, but it's all good.
Oh, really? I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I think I got a bit distracted with a couple bits of that there. Okay. But so unless you are one of the 8 people who own half the world's wealth, you can help yourself by standing with the Black Lives Matter movement and helping it grow into what is found as envisioned it as a rebellion against the racist system that exploits the many. Just to finish off, I think it's important to resist tone policing people who'd otherwise claim to be allies, but they fall into that trap. When BLM is protesting something so hugely exploitative and violent as racist imperialist capitalism, then a raised voice or smashed window as a response is not something to be focused on. You can't commodify every single aspect of living and then not understand looting as a legitimate form of protest. Looting is the ultimate strike against a system that deems mass-produced objects to be far more precious than life itself. It is humanity demanding to be recognised. And that's not a support of every looter or every smashed window, but I think it's important when we see the extremes of these movements on TV and maybe a burning fire every now and then or a shouting person. It's important to remember, I think what comes to my mind is when Jesus flips the table in the temple, because he'd had enough of the people trying to profit at the market in a holy place. And just to finish off, I think my final favourite quote from Jesus is that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the gates of heaven. And I don't know how else that can be interpreted other than the whole system needs to be a lot more equal, and that especially includes Black lives. Thank you, and I apologise.
No, don't. No apologies. Thank you so much, Mally. We really appreciate what you've shared with us. We thank you for encouraging us to look at Black Lives Matter's connections to the wider systems, and for us to reflect on how issues of inequality and poverty in the wider systems impact upon both the movement, but the reasons behind the movement. So we thank you for that. I did see, Ray, when you said something about life being better now than 200 years ago, looking back, he seemed to be quite fondly to his childhood, so that's lovely. And for those online, Jesus turning the tables over along with the palm parade, that was a wonderful sermon at St. David's Uniting Church last week, was all about that, so you might want to look back and get that. Thank you so much, Mally. We'll hear more from you later on when we have our Q&As. But for now, it's over to Moses and to hear his perspective on this. And Moses, as it's only fair, if you want to go over a couple of minutes, feel free. Otherwise, I'll force my way in like I did with Mally, and then we'll have our group chat. But for now, over to Moses.
Well, I'll try to speak as fast as I can, so to get a lot more content in. No, I joke. So my name is Moses, as already been said. I work with the Presbyterian Church in South East Wales Presbytery. I was glad to learn, actually, I didn't know this about Mally, that he's got Ugandan ancestry, he's part Ugandan. I was born in Western Uganda. I'm of the Bachiga tribe, and I grew up there, and I came to the UK when I was 11, and from then I lived down in the south coast of England, and I came to Wales just a few days short of my 19th birthday to start at university. I will kneel for no cause. I will continue to look at statues of historical figures. I am in favour of more funding for the police. And yes, it's because I am Black. More than that, it's because I'm a Christian. Over the next few minutes, I want to lay out some of my thoughts on this important and controversial issue. In particular, I want to interact with issues arising out of the following statement that I found on the website, www.blacklivesmatter.uk. The statement says, "Those of all ethnicities and from all nations who believe in racial equality are anti-racists. We stand together. We can choose to kneel together in peace and solidarity, asserting Black people are treated as equals to white people and is a human right to receive racial equality, social justice, and criminal justice." End quote. There are three main points that I want to briefly touch upon in response to that statement. First, is racism or institutional racism a real thing? Secondly, is there anyone actually asserting that Black people are not equal to white people? And thirdly, what is social or racial criminal justice? So first, is racism a real thing? In short, I answer no, simply because there is no such thing as the black race, nor indeed the white race. There is simply Adam's race, the human race. And I see this as I read the Bible, particularly the early chapters of Genesis. Now, I would refer you to Genesis chapters 8 through 12, and I'm not going to read them to you, because there are quite a few chapters, but I want to raise a few points from those chapters. Firstly, in chapter 9, after the flood, we see God entering a covenant of life, a covenant of preservation with Noah, his family, and all creatures that came out of the ark. On an encouragement side, this is the divine ordinance by which every creature on earth, every human on earth, irrespective of their skin color, can be assured that God will never again destroy the world and its inhabitants with a flood. So after this flood, there literally are only 8 humans in existence: Noah and his wife, their 3 sons, who each had a wife. Thus, every human being alive today can trace their ancestry back to Noah. Now, I realize that is a confessional statement. That is something that I believe, and I believe it because I read it in the Bible. That if you are to take DNA tests or whatever, at some point, you will trace every person who's alive today, has lived, and will ever live back to this group of 8 people. In the Bible passages, in those chapters, it says this: the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. From these 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the whole earth was populated. And of course, remember that also there were 2 of every creature, and by implication, the whole earth was populated with every kind of animals from those that went on the ark. Genesis chapter 10 is a so-called table of nations, in which the people groups that descend from Shem, Ham, and Japheth are listed. And at the end of that chapter, the summary sentence reads like this: these are the clans, or the family people groups, of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies in their nations. And from these, the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. To me, this is highlighting that rather than talking about racism and kind of talking about it as somebody or as prejudice based on like skin color or even like different ethnic origins, we have to advocate strongly for the unity of humankind. There is only one race of people on earth. That is to say, there is only the descendants of Noah. And so to hate or to be prejudicial towards any human, regardless of their color, in some respects is self-hate. You're hating that whom you should love because they're in some way related to you. Summarily, I'd complete this point by saying black is not a nationality. But what we see in the Bible in these chapters is that you have all these different nationalities, all these ethnic groups arising from the descendants of Noah after the flood. So is racism, or institutional racism, is racism a real thing? I say no, because there is only one race. Second, I'm not convinced that there are any reasonable people who assert that black people are in any sense inferior to white people. In the House of Commons yesterday, one MP made the comment that history is taught to make one group of people feel inferior and another group of people feel superior. Now, it's a while since I left school, but if that's true and accurate, then it's not the curriculum that is at fault, it's the teachers there. It's the ideology or that the teachers are portraying. It's not that curriculums need to be decolonized, because I'm unaware of school curriculums, whether here in Wales or in England, in Scotland, where there is a concerted effort to subject the minds of young Black children. Moreover, pulling statues down or removing portraits out of council chambers, I don't think actually changes much. I think it's possibly just a big signal of virtue. As I said, I'm not convinced that any right-thinking person would assert an inherent inequality or vulnerability or inferiority that belongs to someone because of their skin color. Indeed, to assert such a thing would be bewildering to me, because as I read the scriptures, I do not find a definition for vulnerability that approximates to a view where, because of your skin color or because of the history of your ancestors, you are somehow more vulnerable. I do, however, find some passages that go some way to defining categories of people that should be seen as vulnerable and should be, to the best of our abilities, looked to be protected. For instance, Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. I leave that to you to read at your own pleasure, but I do want to raise this point there. In that passage, we're talking about Judgment Day. Jesus is talking about what will happen when he comes. It says, when the Son of Man appears with his angels. And he says, on that day, one of the things that will happen is that your actions, what you have done, will prove your identity. And that identity will either be of a sheep, so somebody who is righteous in the king, in Jesus's eyes, or that of a goat, someone who is wicked, somebody who does not deserve to be in the presence of a righteous king. Now, crucially, it's interesting that the reason that Jesus gives for this discrimination between sheep and goat is based on actions in this life, particularly toward 5 vulnerable groups that I can identify. These groups are the hungry and the thirsty, so those who are without food and without water. This is why I think it's really crucial for us, and I believe strongly that we should be jumping on the campaign to make sure that children who normally receive free school meals somehow are provided for during half term and for as long as possible. So the vulnerable group are those who are hungry and thirsty. The strangers. This is the group that probably most closely approximates, that's probably most in people's minds when we think about those who might be at risk of racial prejudice or racism, or more correctly, xenophobic prejudice. They are strangers in the land, not because they have a different skin color, although they might do so. They are strangers because they don't have citizenship rights. Now, the Bible, throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament, is very clear that people who aren't citizens of the land where you are a citizen, even they have to be treated, remembering that they are descendants of Noah and his sons. They have a certain degree of respect, of care that is to be afforded them. You're not to pervert justice that is due to them. You're not to treat them differently because they're strangers or foreigners. But that's not the same thing as saying that they must have the same rights as those who are citizens. So the strangers, the sick, those who are unwell, and if unwell, they're probably unable to work. So there's need to take care of them. And those who are in prison. Now, Mali spoke about this, and in this passage it says that those who are imprisoned deserve to be visited, or the righteous visit them. So those are vulnerable groups that I see, but note that of those groups, skin color is not a mark of any of them.
If you could begin to sum up in a minute, thanks, Moses, that would be great.
And third and finally, and briefly, on justice, I think the Bible has much to say on the issue of justice. And in the main, the Bible's advice is always that those charged with administering justice, whether it be the state authorities or the police or the military, whoever, they should do so fairly. I'm not convinced that the lack of people that look like me in public leadership, whether in church or politics or business, is unfair. Nor am I convinced that the fact that there are more people who look like me in prison necessarily unfair. I think the Bible's advice is that we should not do no injustice in court. So if people who are in prison happen to be in prison because they did commit a crime, that is fair. There are things that we could do to try to work so that they wouldn't commit crimes, but if they're in prison because they've committed a crime, that is fair. To summarize, I am skeptical towards the Black Lives Matter movement, and I exhort Christians to particularly think about the fact that we, all of us, are sinners living in a fallen world. And most of the times when we think and when we speak about structural injustices, what we're talking about is manifestations of fallen people, sinners, living without the light of God's word in their hearts to enlighten their path. And I wish, I pray that more and more we Christians, the church, would put before the fallen world the light of the gospel so that people may have their lives transformed, and more we would see racism and other injustices, as it were, removed from our world.
Fab. Thank you so much, Moses. Well, one of the many things that's interesting about our two talks is, coming from the issue from very different perspectives, but that passion for justice seems to be woven throughout, even though you come from it from different angles and get to different points from it. But that's fascinating for us to unpack what the Bible says on this matter. But I could say more, and I'd love to, but we don't have time because it's almost time for our group work. Some of you have already sent in some questions. A reminder, for if you'd like, in the time that we will have left, for you to send in the questions to either Mali or Moses, or to both of them, via the chat function, or just text or WhatsApp me, and I'll ask them in a minute. But for now, I think Claire's going to put up the questions on the screen. It may well be that with our two fascinating and very different, very controversial, as Moses said in his introduction, perspectives have got you going on a particular stream that you want to continue going down, which is fab if that's the case. If not, or in addition to that, we'd like you to think about these questions. And you YouTubers can do this too. You can pause the video, go and pick up the phone and ask someone and have a chat and a cup of tea. So question one, thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement. Question one is, have you ever participated in a protest? If so, what was it, and what did you hope it would achieve? Question two, what has been your response to the Black Lives Matter movement? What beliefs or personal experiences do you think have led to such a response? I think we had a good insight there of hearing Moses and Mali's different responses to the movement and some of their personal experiences and beliefs that affected that. Question three, would you consider yourself to be non-racist or anti-racist? If so, how would your actions demonstrate this position? And question four, is there anything that our speakers have said tonight which has made you feel excited or uncomfortable? If so, what was it, and why do you think you had that reaction? I think we can make sure that those questions, I can put them in the chat function for everyone so that you don't have to mark these down, but you may well in your groups want to discuss other things anyway. So we're going to leave it there for now, and we're going to have a minute just to leave them up on the screen so that the introverts can have a minute of quiet and the extroverts can go grab themselves a cup of tea or do whatever you need to do. And then, so at 20 past, you'll be put in your groups, and then you'll have 15 minutes, which I know isn't long, but feel free at the end of this to come back and stay in your groups, or to phone someone up, and for these discussions to go on, because tonight is just that, a conversation starter. So I'm going to stop speaking. We're going to leave those questions up. At 20 past, you'll be put in your groups. So have some quiet time, or do what you need to do till then, and then we'll see you at 25 to. Well, welcome back, everyone. For those on Zoom, it took a while to get everyone back in the room, but hopefully that's because the conversations were so interesting. And time is against us. We were just saying, some of us who were chatting in my group, that we could have another hour for some of the questions that this has raised and the discussions. So we are going to have another. No, we're finishing at 9. Don't worry. So some great topics have been raised. Some fascinating perspectives, personal experience, and beliefs have been shared. And it's time to unpack that a little bit with the questions that have been sent in. I sound like some children's BBC presenter from the 1980s, stamped addressed envelope and all that. Anyway, don't get distracted, Phil. So first question, man. We'll have a question to Mali, question to Moses, question to both of them, and if we have time for a few more. First question to Mali it said thank you, and then it said, what do you think of the argument that identity politics is more divisive than progressive? I did say to Mali, well, we had a chat about who should say what about identity politics. So I'm going to give it a go, then Mali will give his perspective. My layman's terms, and I should have looked up in the break, but my layman's terms is identity politics focuses more perhaps on the particular group of people. It divides a larger group into smaller groups. That perhaps says something about how I see it. But so you can have, certainly in terms of theology, there are things like there is Black theology, feminist theology, queer theology that specializes perhaps in a particular area of thought. And so the question was, if we divide humanity down into smaller kind of groups, is it more divisive than progressive? Mali, over to you.
So I think identity politics is really interesting because there's two ways of approaching how you look at the way humans are, different, whether we want them to be or not. Our society makes them different, even if they're not biologically that way. So identity politics to me means the liberal sense where you say, oh, Black people are oppressed, women are oppressed, and you respond with these token representations. Maybe you put Barack Obama in power, or you have your first woman leading the new Star Wars movie. But it doesn't actually result in much of a material change to your average woman or Black person or disabled. But it doesn't affect the majority. It responds with this tokenism. And as I spoke before about status insecurity, a mental effect of these inequalities, tokenism has been shown by psychologists to have a negative effect again on status insecurity. So I don't agree with identity politics in the kind of contemporary sense that it's used just to, pluck an individual every now and then and put them on a pedestal and use that as the token. And in that sense, the way it's currently used, I do think it is divisive, yes. But I think if you look at humans through a class lens, a class perspective, I think the vast majority of people you meet are in the same class as you. They're not owners of a factory. They're not, owners of huge amounts of capital. So I think primarily you share a class with 99% of the people that you meet. But within that lens, you can have a intersectional way of recognizing how other factors do interact with each other. Although they're not primary, and although that shouldn't make anyone a token, you shouldn't be blind to these other social factors that change how society and individuals perceive one another. And I agree with Moses' point that we are all one race in a biological sense, but the cold reality in sociological terms is that there are these divisions created among us, even if they're not natural. And I don't think it's clever to say, I don't see race, I don't see gender. If you can't see race, how can you see racism? If you don't see gender, how can you see misogyny? But I do I do recognise that at some point we can reach a level where humans do just recognise each other as humans, as we biologically are. We are one race, and it's important to, I think, important to aim for this world where we are all one, and recognise at the moment we're not. But the answer to, getting from this divided place to the unified place isn't through token representation, through this, which is what identity politics normally means. It's through helping, the communities, the material realities of the average person from these disenfranchised and marginalized communities. That's what I think.
Thank you, Manly. Which might feed into the to Moses's bringing up of the sheep and goats of. But I'll leave Moses to answer that. So Moses, feel free to respond to that question a bit more. But also the question for you is, and I've lost it, but I shared it with you before. There are different views on the Bible, and by that I think the person means some Christians take it literally, some take passages metaphorically or myth, etc. What about the Good Samaritan? Isn't there racism in that?
Yeah, so first of all, just to touch on something that Mally was just saying about like how we get to that unified place where we recognize one another for humans. And yes, the sheep and goat story actually would provide a base for me saying actually no amount of activism, whether political, socio-economic or whatever, is actually going to get us to that place because the main or the foundational problem that we have is that there is something wrong with us and something that we can't change of ourselves. That is that we are fallen creatures. Apart from the work of the Holy Spirit in our hearts, bringing God's word to bear fruit in us, we're unable to come to that unity. And indeed, the Holy Spirit brings that unity in the end in bringing us to be sheep of Jesus Christ, the shepherd. So yes, there is and there are gradations, I guess, along that journey, but I don't think we get there by our own point. And I'd also criticize the point about seeing us all in a class. I would agree with that, and I'd say that the class that we should finally see ourselves in is that of sinners. And if you're in church, if you're a Christian, then you are a sinner who is redeemed, and that so. We talk about how the guilt for our sins and the nature that is sinful has been removed from us by the work of Christ. But there is still a bit of us that there is a part of the old man, as it were, still a part of us. So, so I would criticize the intersectional kind of interactions in that. So to answer the question of, yes, there are different Christian views on the Bible, and isn't the Good Samaritan racism? I accept that there are different views on the Bible, and from my position, I would say no, the Good Samaritan is not showing racism, because if we go to the text, which is what my position would demand that I do, go to the text and ask the question, what is the occasion for Christ teaching using the Good Samaritan? Well, the occasion is that somebody has come to him and asked him a question, and he has responded by pointing him back to the written word. And from that, another question has been asked, what is it that one must, well, the question is, what is it that must do to inherit eternal life? What is it that must do to be at the judgment day amongst the sheep, not the goats? And the answer is, well, love the Lord with all your heart, etc., and love your neighbor as yourself. And then the story, the parable is told to illustrate a character, two characters not doing that, and one doing that. And so from that, I wouldn't take anything to do with race or color or ethnicities or nationality or whatever. I would take from it simply that some of the characters in that parable failed to do a basic command of God's word, which is to care for a vulnerable person. That person injured, left for dead, is a vulnerable person, and regardless of who you are, there is an obligation upon you to help, and they failed to do that. And this one, the Samaritan, did what was expected of them. They helped when they used their resources to do what is commanded of all of us, to help if we can when we come across people who are vulnerable. So I wouldn't bring race into that story. I would say this is somebody responding to a real, actual need.
Thank you, Moses. Mally, you'll get a chance in a second to come back to any of those points if you want. But the only disadvantage about having two such passionate, eloquent individuals talking about this subject is that we just don't have the time. So I'm going to restrict, if I can try, your answers. Mally, I'll give you about 90 seconds, 30 seconds of response and 60 seconds to answer. And Moses, I'm going to give you just about 60 seconds to answer this question, and then you'll have a chance to kind of finish up. So this question goes to both of you. And it comes from something that Moses said, but it says, no reasonable person would assert that someone was inferior based on their race. Plenty of unreasonable people do assert that. How do we respond to these people? So a nice quick answer if you can, lads.
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Sure. Within Moses' talk, he said something along the lines of, no reasonable person would assert that someone is inferior based on their race, but plenty of reasonable people do assert that, and how do we respond to them? And as I gave Moses a little bit more warning on this, I'll go to him first.
I guess summarily, say be reasonable. Don't become unreasonable like them. But I would also defer to the example of the Apostle Paul. Writing to the Thessalonians, he says to them how because of his affection for the Thessalonians, he and the people with him were pleased not only to bring to them the gospel by words, but to share with them their very lives. And so I think with unreasonable people, when you can't win them with words, try to win them by your conduct amongst them. And so that's how I would attempt to communicate and go on with unreasonable people. Definitely not by becoming unreasonable.
And concise, amazing. Thanks, Moses. Mally, you can come back to the other points and your answer to that.
So I think people don't have these biases, they don't say these racist things. I agree that people don't consciously think it. But I don't think it's about that conscious thing. I think the vast majority of people vastly agree that we're all equal. But I think it's about when you assert certain things, it's reliant on these premises. And so when you say that there's a reason why there's a disproportionate amount of black people in jail, if you don't think it's because of wider social reasons, then what excuse do you have, unless you're saying black people are more prone to that? Or, unless you have a societal reason for why these people are in jail or are being oppressed or acting a certain way, then what other explanations do you have other than a biological one, which to me is a racist or is a problematic premise. I feel like did I hear your question properly then?
Yeah. I think you answered that, and but perhaps a bit more of, if you did want to say any more about how do we respond to the unreasonable people.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I think it often takes time and emotion as much as logic, really. It's not normally about just proving someone right on the spot, and I think it does require a lot of patience and just a certain emotional set of skills from oneself to be able to deal with those people. And I think everyone is open to any idea really given enough time, and no one is born thinking a certain way or being racist or anti-racist. And for those small subsets of people who really do have those deeply entrenched prejudice beliefs, they obviously care for the most part, from my experience, they care very deeply about that. And that's an energy that can be diverted onto something more positive from my experience. And so if you give them the time and the effort, I think they can easily become allies, and, valuable ones, rather than, angered people from opposite viewpoints.
Thanks, Mally. What I think is interesting, as I kind of referenced before the break, is though you come from and two very different views, your passion for justice, your love of neighbour, and your desire for debate and dialogue, and your understanding that there's benefit in that for all is common, which is fab. Last quick thing, and again, if you can be concise, that'd be great. Any other final thoughts, or I should say final thought, and are there any books or resources you would recommend us to go to for further reading on your perspective? We'll go to Mally first.
Thank you guys very much for listening to me ramble on. Firstly, I guess, I think mainly, as much as anyone can read on a subject, I don't think there's any better way of learning on these important topics than getting involved with them. Maybe attend a protest or a movement for a few times and talk to the people there. You don't necessarily have to be in support, but I think there's no better way to learn about these things than getting involved with them through action. And I guess for reading, I know I sound a bit off my rocker when I start criticizing capitalism, because it seems like there's no alternative. But Conquest of Bread by Peter Krokotkin is it's a hard read, but poetic at points, and paints the idea of different forms of society beautifully. And there was one more I had that's gone from my mind. I don't know why I didn't write it down. It's not around me. Angela Davis, Peter Kropotkin. If I can think of, but mainly Conquest of Bread. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mally. We'll be thanking you properly in a second, but that's great for now. And Moses.
Yes, I would also echo Mally's thanks for inviting me to participate in this discussion. And I think final thought would be there was something raised about unconscious bias, whether that's a real thing. I guess I want to just touch on it and say I think it is, but I'll probably qualify it by saying that I'll probably talk more about unconscious ignorance, and can it be overcome, or how do we deal with it? Well, as a Christian and one who believes in God's supernatural work by the Holy Spirit, today I'd say that the only way to really overcome these things that we don't even know that we have ourselves is by God working upon us. And so I'd encourage Christians to pray that through common grace and special grace, that those things that we aren't even aware that we do, that are wrong and harmful to people, would somehow be restrained. And in terms of books, I would two books I'd encourage you to read. Of course, it's a given that you should read the Bible, and so read the Bible. That's not one of the two books. The two books, first, a book by Kevin DeYoung and Greg Gilbert. It's called The Mission of the Church. Now, I first read this book a couple of years ago, and it really helped me to think through the social justice movement. And I do think that generally the issues that we started to speak about tonight are part and parcel of that. And in terms of thinking theologically, actually the kind of the theological I don't know, sector of knowledge that this all fits in is probably to do with mission. So how, as a commissioned people, do we engage with the world that we live in? So The Mission of the Church by DeYoung and Gilbert. And the second one is by a guy called David Van Drunen. I think that's how you say his name, Van Drunen. And the book is called Politics After Christendom. And this is possibly the best book I've read in the past 6 or so months. And it's it's talking about like natural law and justice, and the how the public sphere is a place for Christians to engage in, but also a place that everybody should be engaged on. And he takes a long time to develop his argument by looking at those chapters from Genesis that I mentioned. So looking at Noah, God's covenant with Noah, and use that as a starting point to advocate for Christians engaging in political and controversial discussions for the sake of not just the church, but for the wider world.
Fab. And I think that's some of what we've done tonight. Thank you for those recommendations, Moses. I realized as you two were summing up there, I mean, it's not an accident I put on this t-shirt, but I think maybe this t-shirt combines both of your outlook in one. It's because it's from the Magnificat, and it says, "Cast down the mighty, send the rich away, fill the hungry, and lift up the lowly." Perhaps that's a cross-section of some of the views we've heard tonight. We'll be thanking our guests in a minute, but just a reminder to you on Zoom and on YouTube, next month, because we thought this was a bit, light inequality and Black Lives Matter, next month we're going to do death. It is a subject that perhaps we don't talk about too much and we shy away from. We've got two fantastic speakers on the 30th of November, as it says there. We've got one bereavement counsellor who has a Buddhist outlook, and she's going to share some of her personal experiences and perspectives, and a Welsh United Reformed Church minister and moderator who happens to be a former chaplain to a hospice, and he's going to share his perspective on the issue too. And after that one, I think we're going to have one on humour. Are there any limits to humour to kind of counterbalance the death? Although sometimes the two can go hand in hand. So please do come along to that one. So a huge thanks goes to Bethan, our comms queen, for advertising and posters and stuff. It goes to Claire, who I rope in for these things, and it's very much appreciated that she's been facilitating tonight. It goes to our Zoomers who are here live, especially Aisha, because Aisha helped us when we were without a speaker and helped us get in touch with Mali and invite him along, which we're hugely thankful for. And the biggest thanks of all, of course, goes to Mali and Moses. You've been generous and I would say courageous and thought-provoking, and so much more in what you've shared with us this evening. So I really thank you both for being willing to give us the time to do that. And I'll say more, but I'll say that once everyone else is gone, once we've got rid of these lot. But thank you so much. To end then, I saw a little that there. To end, I thought it wouldn't be too controversial to end with this quote from Desmond Tutu, which may again bring us all together. He says, "We are temples of God, each one of us, every one of us, and God is asking you here, please be my partners. Will you please be my collaborators? Will you please help me to bring peace where there is war? Will you please help me to bring joy where there is sadness? Will you please help me to make my children know that they are my children, that we belong together, that we will survive only together, that we will be free only together, that we will be human only together." Go well this week, be hopeful, be human, be blessed, and see you all soon. Bye for now.